Hi, we thought we would talk about how resentment builds up in relationships. I saw you nod.
Yes, it's a good topic.
And one of the main things that we see about resentment building up and what we've experienced between each other is it's when communication breaks down. And often assumptions are being made, things aren't being talked about, and then the two parties are living in their separate realities, and in those separate realities, resentment just builds and builds and builds. And I was thinking about, probably the most dire time that happened in our relationship when it was after our second daughter was born, and your photographic career had almost completely disappeared at that point in time in the midst of the digital
Yes.
revolution. You'd gone from flying first class all around the world to now doing these little photo shoots for...
Yes, even now.
Sorry. Are you twitching?
Even now it hurts.
Sorry. I'm not meaning to rub
I
salt
know.
in the wound.
I know.
I'm just trying to set the
I
context.
know, I'm just having a flashback.
You okay?
Yes.
We continue.
Yes.
And I had a full-time job, an admin job at the time. And after our second daughter was born, I was given 3 months maternity leave, and then the expectation was that I would go back to work to my full-time job because that's what I had. And Angus, you didn't have sort of any steady income at that point in time. But I just let the resentment build up inside of me, and I didn't have the important conversations with you because I was making assumptions in my own mind. I'd already decided that it was too difficult to work out. Therefore, I just had to resign myself to this one choice that I really didn't want to do. And I don't think I even talked to you about the fact that I didn't want to go back to work, did I?
I don't
Beforehand?
I'm not sure. Maybe. I don't know. I don't think... Well, No, I don't think you did. Or I certainly didn't hear that.
No, we talked about it years later.
We did.
And you said to me years later, I never asked you to go back to work.
Yes.
And I could really see that was all me living in my own assumptions, and we just hadn't really talked about how upset I was about it, how I really didn't want to do it, and I felt like I didn't have a choice, and because we didn't have those conversations, that ended up with both of us really polarizing.
Yeah, drifting apart. Yeah, I think for me, I don't know, I just feel like I really was burying my head in the sand, and that was my coping mechanism. In the same way someone might choose to go take a drink, drown their sorrows in a bottle of vodka or whatever the drug du jour may be that may be able to take the edge off. I think for me, I just decided I'm just not going to talk about it. And that was my coping mechanism. So in a sense, you were probably feeling resentful. I was just being an ostrich. And in that situation, there just was no communication or meaningful connection. And I think that just became an unhealthy normal over what was probably quite a long period of time, maybe years. But it was this sort of feeling that, as far as I was concerned, America was just not working out in any way, shape or form. And yes, I did have to weather the digital storm as I saw it. And I just want to make a correction here. It wasn't as if I was flying first class all the time. There were a few first class flights. It wasn't like I was such a jet setter, but I definitely had a taste of the good life. And then juxtaposed to that was this experience of being right at the opposite end of the scale. So I felt really depressed. And I think there was a part of me that was kind of fatalistic, that if I just bury my head in the sand, something, maybe we'll just end up back in the UK, which is kind of where I wanted to be, because I didn't like being here. And being here just seemed to be synonymous with suffering, because I just wasn't able to make ends meet. So you had gone back to work, and that we had, had our first daughter.
Second. Yeah.
See how checked out I was.
I was referring to the time after our second daughter, but I did go back to work after the first
Yeah,
one.
I think it probably started with the first one, and by
yeah.
the time we got to the second daughter, it was kind of like it got to a critical state of proceedings. but it was still, nevertheless, that was my coping mechanism, just to sort of like just completely go into myself and be cut off and kind of be in a cave. And all communication just seemed kind of scary, because in your mind you wanted to stay in the States, and I guess in my mind I wanted to be back in the UK, and it just felt there was just no room for us to get to any kind of meaningful resolution. And I just wasn't even prepared to explore that with you. That was the problem. That, you know, my lack of vulnerability around that position meant that we just didn't communicate really.
Well, I think that was it for both of us. Each of us were afraid of being vulnerable and really opening our hearts up to each other. For me, it was because I just didn't. I felt like I needed to have the solution, which is kind of crazy. Obviously, you have the conversation to get to the solution, but I felt like it was a foregone conclusion that we would end up leaving the U.S., and I really didn't want to go. And I was very determined, and so that was part of why I was, ready to go back to work so that we could stay here. But it wasn't without a price, and the price was my resentment building, and your resentment building too, and that was kind of the breakdown in communication between us.
Yeah, we totally stopped being a team.
Yeah.
And there was no room for a conversation in that state of mind. You had your desires to stay here, and I think for me it just seemed like if I was going to stay in the States, I was just going to have to really like take on some sort of menial job. Away from photography, and because I'd had a taste of the good life, my ego just couldn't bear or countenance the thought of that.
But you didn't mind me doing a menial job.
I know, that's what's so unfair in the whole situation. So there were many reasons to feel like I just was burying my head in the sand. That's the only way to look at it. Yeah. I was so afraid of my own experience that I just feel like I just went into, probably buried my head in the sand, was just spending hours learning Photoshop or whatever I would do in front of my computer at the time.
Yeah. So now looking back, what I see that we didn't see at the time that would have been tremendous benefit is just each of us being more willing to be open to our emotional experience and being able to share what was going on with each other without knowing what the solution would be. I went in, I didn't have the conversation because I had just had a conclusion in my mind as to where it would end up, and I didn't like that conclusion. But that just meant that I was completely closed off, and I had made assumptions that I hadn't checked out. And it sounds like we're doing the same thing.
Yeah. And I think that the idea of having a conversation for me just meant that it was just so loaded and so charged that it would just fall apart at the seams very quickly. So there is something really interesting about that vulnerability piece in a way where we can kind of bare our soul without really getting caught up in the sort of the self-judgment, which is really, a fear of someone else's judgment. It's really our own judgment towards ourselves that's surfacing. And I guess I just was living in a state of fear. And there's something to be said for just being able to power through that fear in that moment, feel those feelings, express those feelings. Be vulnerable, and in a sense, as we've mentioned before, that is the gateway back to the impersonal, where hopefully, a connection will be achieved.
And what ended up happening is that we just drifted further and further apart. I ended up getting attracted to someone else because I was feeling so alone and isolated, and then our relationship blew up anyway. So we didn't really avoid it, but it took something that big to get us both willing to have the conversation and be open and vulnerable with each other and honest.
Yeah, and there is something also very interesting about that it takes something catastrophic on the human level to sort of bring us back to our spiritual center, which is, I think that's what happened at that point. It's like, ultimately, we I'd like to think we love and adore one another, but it took that sort of cataclysmic event to sort of really just blow everything up, and everything needed to be blown up. In fact, it was an enormous reboot that was taking us back to our factory default settings, which is one of love and deep respect.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that, in the sense that if our experiences as spiritual beings having a human experience is to grow and learn in consciousness, I can safely say categorically that was definitely a situation, as painful as it was, that took me to another level.
Yeah, and I'm really, really grateful that we were able to find our way in that. And our encouragement to you is to see the opportunity earlier, so it doesn't necessarily have to take something that painful that happened between us, but to see the wisdom in being able to share openly, honestly, authentically, even if you don't know where it's going to take you, even if you don't know, or even if you think you know, like I did. I thought it was going to end at one place. And, if we had been able to come together and share open-heartedly, I'm sure we would have figured something out that worked for both of us.
Yeah, I guess in a sense, is like, again, the vulnerability piece is to be in acceptance of what is.
Yeah.
And I was so not, neither of us were in acceptance
Yeah.
of what is.
Yeah.
So it took a cataclysmic event for us to find our way to that state of mind.
Yeah. And so for you, hopefully, there's just this little reminder that will help you to remember to come back into the moment and to see the safety and well-being that lies within in this moment in time, and to be open-hearted in your relationship and or your relationships, and see where that goes.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Take care.
Take care.